私は生まれ変わった。何に？救世主に。そう。救世主に私は生まれ変わったのだ。
Oh yeah, I'm thinking Kino. Subahibi is a cult classic visual novel that's had a deep impact on me and many others. It's both a remake and reimagining of the 1999 horror Denpa visual novel Tsui no Sora, also known as End Sky. A cult classic in its own right, and although Subahibi shares a lot in common with End Sky, it's very much its own thing. Which is why, given the success of Subahibi, the 10th and 15th anniversary limited time box sets came bundled with a more faithful remake of the original as bonus content. Given the fact that the only legal way of obtaining this remake of End Sky is through buying a Subahibi anniversary copy, it's clear that it's meant to be seen as a secondary work. Basically, as very high effort fan service to Subahibi and End Sky fans. Which I think is a bit of a shame, because I really believe that End Sky Remake holds very well on its own. Though, I understand why this decision was made. If you could buy End Sky Remake separately, it creates a question of legitimacy. Which is a true spiritual successor of the original End Sky? Subahibi or the more faithful remake? By forcing readers to get a limited time copy of Subahibi in order to get a copy of End Sky Remake, it makes it quite clear that Tsukaji and the team at Kerokyu consider Subahibi to be the definitive version of the story, and that this remake is really there to pay proper respect to the original. Now, I stand behind what I said earlier, that End Sky Remake is a solid work in its own right, and in certain respects, it's actually easier to recommend to people given its shorter length and faster pacing. That said, I can't deny that it seems to be intended to be a companion piece to Subahibi, and on that front alone, it's quite fascinating to compare and contrast the similarities and differences.
すべての生は20日で終わる。これは紛れもない真実だ。世界は20日で終わる。これは紛れもない真実だ。
Both are essentially alternative visions of the same source, with Subahibi vastly expanding on their original idea, and End Sky Remake also expanding on the idea, though with the goal of remaining more faithful to the original. On that front, they feel equally valid, and both do a good job of portraying their intended vision. And when it comes to how these two visions both differ and compare, I found the chapter focusing on Takashima Zakuro's to be the most fascinating, since on the one hand, they start from different places, but by the end, they virtually share an identical conclusion. That's why I want to focus on Zakuro's story arc, and how essentially two different characters that share the same name arrive at the same place. In both cases, it's already established, before we even get to her chapter, that she dies before the main events of the previous chapters. So by the time we get to her point of view, we already know what we're in for. So let's start with the tragedy of the Zakuro most of us would be familiar with, her Subahibi counterpart. Her chapter, appropriately titled Looking Glass Insects, opens with her quoting and reflecting on Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass and what Alice found there. The first scene of her chapter begins with her talking with another character. At the end of their conversation, after it steers into a dark direction, she thinks to herself, "Right now, I can't really think like that. I kind of wouldn't mind if the two people could live on happily and be happy forever. That's what I thought when I talked to Mamiya, that the world could be happy, that you can be happy. That's what I wanted to pray for." I find this to be the perfect setup for her character arc, since the severe bullying and abuse we see her have to endure later on in the chapter challenges this pure idealism within her. And in a very twisted way, the decision that results in her ending her own life actually stems from a refusal to fully let go of that idealism. What I mean is that despite being relentlessly victimized and exposed to just how cruel and heartless some people can be, she still is capable of seeing good in the world, and she wants to protect that good. But before we get into the details on that, let's go through a brief overview of her. Despite the horrible situation she finds herself in, she's not an isolated person. She considers Kimika to be her friend, despite Kimika basically giving her the cold shoulder to protect herself from getting bullied, something Kimika ends up feeling very guilty about. But what's interesting is that the source of Kimika's guilt stems from Zakuro's overt forgiveness of her betrayal. Zakuro readily understands why Kimika behaves this way, and doesn't hold it against her, which ends up only making Kimika feel worse. But for our purposes, what's crucial here is that Zakuro clearly sees good in Kimika and doesn't hold her instincts of self-preservation against her. In her own way, Zakuro wants to protect Kimika, even if self-sacrifice is the only way she knows how. Then comes her most significant relationship, her relationship to Yuki, who she believes to be Mamiya. Zakuro is in love with Yuki, and I think the main reason Zakuro develops a further interest in literature is simply because that's Yuki's main interest. In other words, her interest in literature stems from a place of wanting to understand and relate better to Yuki, which carries significance in her final scene. Otherwise, Zakuro is kind of a dopey girl. I wouldn't say she's dumb, but even if her grades are good, which is a detail I don't remember, she's by no means a street smart or cunning person. And that's where she ends up getting exploited, falling into a sort of sandpit where her tormentors keep escalating the abuse into further and further sexual exploitation. Then after she gets forcefully deflowered against her will, she breaks and loses all hope. Meanwhile, she's in contact with a strange person online. This person claims that something good will happen to her, that good thing being a person's death. The next day, one of the men that had forcibly took her innocence dies. Just as the message had said, this encourages her to reach out and meet with the person who had sent her that prediction. It then turns out that the people who had been trying to get in contact with her are two other girls from a different high school who have also been subjected to similar abuse that Zakuro had to endure. The girls then take Zakuro to a cafe and explain why they were so desperate to get into contact with her. They tell her that the three of them are reincarnated angels, and that in their previous life they were fighting against the forces of evil together. In fact, they had defended their world from destruction, and that the same evil force was now looking to destroy this world. And to prevent them from getting in the way this time around, it had interfered with their reincarnation on Earth by sealing away their powers and memories. This same evil force, she tells Zakuro, was responsible for possessing the people who had abused them, and was doing so to prevent them from interfering with its plan. They tell Zakuro that if they don't regain their powers, then the world will be destroyed very soon, on July 20th. To regain their powers, however, they need to undergo a dangerous ritual called Spiral Matai. And by dangerous, I mean suicidal, as it requires them to jump off the roof of a tall building.
Sora!
Zakuro is so relieved to meet others that share her trauma that she needs almost no convincing about this backstory, buying fully into it by the end of her conversation with Usami and Ayumi. It is my belief that all the girls involved with the Spiral Matai are on some deeper level aware of what they're really doing. And despite some hallucinations we later see from Zakuro's perspective, I believe that she nonetheless is also aware of what the morbid result of what this ritual will actually be. Yet all the same, I think she's also committed to Usami's fantastical interpretation for the reason behind their suffering. As we see in that final scene on the rooftop, Zakuro ends up being the most unhinged of all three of them.
ここでもしひるんだら世界は破滅してしまうのよ。
and I think that conflict stems, ironically, from a deep level of agreement within herself for why she's doing what she's doing. One part of her, I'm convinced, is fully aware that the only result of her jumping from that roof is her life ending, which is made evident when she screams,
"モンパナシュ!"
quoting from the book Yuki lent her, Cyrano de Bergerac. These are the last words of the main character, and certainly Zakuro is aware of this as she quotes it before jumping. And given her brutal defilement, it's understandable that a strong part of her just wants everything to end. Yet, on the other hand, I think she's desperate for Usami's story to be true, but not as escapism for herself, but rather as a means to protect Yuki, who she loves. Zakuro's feelings for Yuki are heavily complicated by the fact that she constantly confuses Mamiya for Yuki and vice versa. Yuki holds all her affection and infatuation, but Mamiya's presence, to the contrary, makes her feel uncomfortable, meaning there are times that she is deeply impressed by Yuki and other times that she's deeply put off. One of those instances that she's deeply put off is when she witnesses Mamiya getting savagely bullied by one of the same people involved in her own bullying. Here is her Prince Charming, the person who inspires her, the person who she wants more than any other to protect her. And instead, she comes to this conclusion. There is no way for him to rebuff the bully. He couldn't do anything. He looked pathetic, just like me. Just like that, weak people live their entire lives being stepped on by the strong. That's the worst. Everything here is awful. Given the broader context of Zakuro's circumstances, I believe that the here she is referring to is the world itself. But the reason she agrees to save the world is because there are some good people in it, like Yuki, who to her perception is also helpless to the same bullies. If he can't defend himself, then it's up to her to do it, and she makes this quite clear in their final interaction. Essentially, one part of Zakuro has reached the breaking point and just wants to be done with this world. Yet, another part of her wants to save and protect one of the few good people in this corrupt world. Given how physically helpless she is to protect Yuki, this delusion allows her another means to do so. And so both motives reinforce the same conclusion: to jump. It's that final scene on the rooftop that always gets me. It's almost a self-contained drama in and of itself. And the differences of this scene in this version, and in Sky remakes, function as representatives of everything that is similar and different about the two works. So I want to reserve that scene-by-scene comparison for after we cover who Zakuro is in Sky Remake. I was actually quite surprised by just how different Zakuro is in this story. Yet despite being essentially a different character, I was impressed by just how real this alternative version felt. Both iterations of Zakuro feel valid, and how they both arrive at the same endpoint is what's interesting to see. From a plot standpoint, both still play the same role, as it's Zakuro's death in both stories that serve as a catalyst for the events which transpire. What's significantly different is who they are as people. Just by comparing their designs tells you a lot about them. If Zakuro in Subahibi is gentle, timid, naive, and idealistic, the first thing we notice in Sky Remake is that she's almost the opposite. She's cold, defensive, smart, and cynical. Zakuro never fully loses her idealism in Subahibi, with her crush on Yuki being the last thread of optimism that refuses to break, preferring to break herself over cutting that thread. Zakuro in Sky Remake, however, is somebody who's lost any reason to trust anyone other than herself. At one time, she was popular, sociable, respected, and considered a model student. She was somebody of serious potential, which was recognized by her classmates and teachers, and in a prep school like the one she attends, this is all social currency. And then it happens. Suddenly the floor collapses from beneath her. She returns home one day to find her mother packing her bags in a panic. Her mother insists that they have to leave by evening. Zakuro, who's understandably flustered, questions what's going on. And after a back and forth, her mother tells her, "Fine, if you want to stay, then stay, but I need to leave." She then leaves with Zakuro's younger brother, and Zakuro stubbornly remains. Apparently her father was caught embezzling lots of money. To avoid scandal with her neighbors, her mother decides to leave, fearing that by the following morning their family will be the talk of the town. Come that following day, several intimidating men break into the house, questioning where Zakuro's mom is. Zakuro explains what her mother told her, and they laugh it off. While it's true that her father was caught embezzling money, the real issue is that her mother had borrowed lots of money from the Yakuza and has now jumped bail. Basically, in the most violent and tragic way possible, Zakuro finds out that her happy home life and the parents she loved were all living a lie. And the Yakuza are concerned with only one thing: collecting their debts. Since her mother is nowhere to be found, the Yakuza give Zakuro an ultimatum. She can either work for them, or they could take her brother and use him to record videos of a highly illegal nature that they can sell on the black market. Zakuro, who at this point feels completely betrayed by both her parents, feels protective of the one other person who's also a victim of this situation. So she agrees to work with the Yakuza in his place. Although she's told that she'll only have to do massages, predictably, it almost immediately escalates to prostitution. Her reputation at school shatters, and even the teachers don't want to get involved once they see that she's associating with people who look like the Yakuza. The once popular girl who was beloved by teachers and classmates alike was now social nuclear waste, nobody wanting anything to do with her. On top of that, she's completely abandoned by her family. One of the things I find saddest about this version of Zakuro is that whereas her Subahibi counterpart had a relationship with Yuki as something positive in her life, here, the person who she feels most connected with is another girl who still treats her as a friendly acquaintance. They aren't friends, but in treating Zakuro no differently than from how she did before getting ostracized, it serves as a pleasant reminder that her life used to be different. And aside from this single acquaintance, Zakuro is aloof and distrusting of anyone else, and if anyone tries to penetrate through her icy exterior, she gets aggressively defensive, as we see with her interactions with both Ayana and Yasuko, which really highlights the difference between these two versions. Zakuro in Enskai Remake is too assertive to ever get bullied or tricked into something the way she is in Subahibi. It's actually her conversation with Yasuko which really showcases this, as Yasuko eventually confronts Zakuro, trying to fish out a confession that she's involved with prostitution. Throughout this interaction, Zakuro has her defenses up and tries to offer as little information as possible. Yasuko eventually mentions that she can help her leave that line of business, assuring her that she has connections with the gravure industry, which for those that don't know is basically softcore pornography, insisting that while the work would still be of a lewd nature, it's surely preferable to prostitution. Zakuro, embodying the wisdom of "fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me," rejects the offer outright, as she's well aware of the tactics and false promises commonly used in sex trafficking. Regardless of whether Yasuko's intentions were good or not, I think given her limited information from personal experience, Zakuro made the right call to both be suspicious of the offer and to outright deny it. However, if Zakuro from Subahibi were having this conversation, I could imagine her being suspicious, but I couldn't imagine her being strong-willed enough to act on those suspicions. Whereas this version of her has no issue being assertive when necessary. Even Zakuro's interactions with the two girls who she ends up skydiving with are subtly but significantly different. In Subahibi, Zakuro is receptive to both of them from the start, but doesn't feel fully connected to them until she learns that they've been through the same sort of trauma that she's been through. In Enskai Remake, however, although Zakuro is also fairly receptive to them, she gets defensive when they say that they understand her.
何が私の何がわかるの？そんな経験ないでしょ？
It's only after they reveal that they've also suffered very similar sorts of trauma that she calms down.
みんなの前でセックスさせられるなんて私たちは当たり前だった。
In other words, she's incapable of fully trusting anyone that hasn't been through what she's been through. But after this connection is made, she then completely identifies with them, reflecting just how isolated she really is. She doesn't have a Yukio or even a Kimika to connect with. These two girls and their belief about having to save the world is all she has, and this provides her with meaning that she's desperate for, as is made clear in her conversation with Ayana.
そうやってどいつもこいつも私を捨てていった。私が全てを持っている時は取り巻いてたくせに私をそうやって見捨てていったんだ。お前たちが。だから私の存在は空虚になった。この世界にとって意味のない私の生を終わらせる。私はこの世界からこぼれ落ちたんだ。ならば私の生に意味があれば生きていける。だからそれを手に入れる。
そのために死ぬことになっても？終わらない世界に意味を与えて世界を終わらすの？小説にエンディングがあることにより登場人物に意味があるように世界にエンディングを作って自分に意味を付け加えるの？うるさい。あなたなんかに何がわかる？私は死ぬんじゃない。世界を救うんだ。
For me, the delivery of that last line
私は死ぬんじゃない。世界を救うんだ。
is just as important as what she's saying. You can hear the venom in her voice and the emotional commitment behind her words. However, escaping Ayana's assessment of a situation is about as futile as trying to escape fate. Technically, at this point, Zakuro doesn't know what the spiral matai will require of her. In both versions, she only finds out that the plan is to jump off a building after they've already gathered and finalized their preparations. It's at this moment, again in both versions, that her two partners waver. And although Zakuro is initially shocked to learn the truth of what they're to do, she quickly counters their change of heart with a complete belief in doubling down on their cause, reiterating their words back at them, only with an absolute sense of conviction. It's in this final scene that these two stories and two versions of Zakuro finally converge, which just makes it even more irresistible for comparison, because despite being basically identical scenes, they feel very different. And that difference, in my opinion, comes in large part in how the separate voice actresses manage to fully embody their particular version of this character. Both Zakuros are fully committed to jumping off, but their motivations differ. We've already established the two contradictory, yet morbidly complementary motivations which commit Zakuro and Subahibi to take the plunge. But what about an N-Sky remake? Well, ironically, despite how much Zakuro would protest against it, Ayana diagnosed Zakuro's deeper subconscious motivation perfectly.
終わらない世界に意味を与えて世界を終わらすの？小説にエンディングがあることにより登場人物に意味があるように。
Zakuro is desperate for meaning, and the scary thing is, whereas in Subahibi it's clear from her second to last line that she is referencing the last line of the main character in her favorite play, confessing an awareness of her own imminent end. This version of Zakuro seems to fully believe in the cause that Usami and Ayumi told her, down until the very last second of her life. This is despite them overtly admitting that it's something Ayumi made up to cope with their difficult circumstances, which Zakuro vehemently rejects point blank and then pulls them back into line. And that's exactly what makes this version of the ending feel so distinct. Zakuro, in this version, needs to believe the delusion. In Subahibi, Zakuro sounds hysteric and unhinged throughout this final scene.
いい？うさみちゃん。怯えは形のない怪物なの。心を惑わして 悪い結果を呼び込むなよ。
But in N-Sky Remake, although Zakuro also comes across as hysteric, her hysteria isn't unhinged, but rather downright psychotic and threatening.
恐れに飲み込まれるな。真実を見えなくする闇こそが恐れの正体なの。今さら何を迷っているの。私たちが出会えた奇跡こそが何よりもこの儀式が本物である証明じゃない。
Which I think accurately captures the nuance of her personality, because this version of herself is strong-willed, and despite basically just meeting these two other girls, she establishes herself as the most dominant figure of that group, and she leads them to their collective demise with complete confidence and belief in what she is doing. Whereas in Subahibi, I don't even think Zakuro herself is really fully aware of what she's rambling about before plunging from the roof, dragging her two compatriots in the process. Lastly, on that note, I think the difference between the two end credit sequences which conclude the respective endings for both works really highlights their differences as well. I always tear up when I hear Shumatsu no Bisho play, as everything from the melody to the lyrics instills a contemplative mood focused on everything Zakuro had to endure. It encourages you to reflect back and really think about the full tragedy of her situation. Whereas in N-Sky Remake, the screen whites out and then steadily dissolves to a shot of the rooftop that is now desolate, reminding us that just moments ago, there were 3 girls here, and now they're gone. The space itself is indifferent to their presence or absence, and that instills a sort of callous melancholy, which perfectly reinforces the different tone of this work. I've always appreciated Takashima Zakuro. When reading a different version of her, it shows just how deep and versatile she is as a character. Functionally, she could have just been treated as a plot device, her death serving as a trigger for Mamiya's apocalyptic death cult. But both these iterations of her deeply explore her circumstances and convincingly establish why she concludes things the way she does. Thank you for watching. It takes me really wanting to communicate something strongly enough to go through the process of video editing, as it's writing rather than recording and editing, which comes naturally to me. That said, I'm interested in being more active than I was before, so if you found this video interesting, please consider following the channel. Furthermore, if you did enjoy this video, you might find one of my past videos just as interesting, so please consider checking out my backlog, as it's not a long list. But most importantly, once again, thank you for listening.